Hey there, I'm Farmer Dave, and here at Farmer Dave's we grow an awful lot of fruits and vegetables. And one thing we've learned is that we can significantly expand our season by starting a lot of our crops in the greenhouses pretty much in the winter. That gives us that much more time of growth. Also, by starting a lot of our crops as transplants in the greenhouse, it gives us a jump against the weeds, and we're able to combat those weeds a lot easier starting with a larger plant in the field rather than a plant by seed. We still grow some crops directly seeded in the fields, but every year we're growing more and more of our crops by starting them in the greenhouse. And over the years we've had this evolution. As we're growing more and more crops in the field, in the greenhouses, or starting them in the greenhouses, we're trying to figure out how to do all this seeding more quickly and enter machines. It used to be that we would just simply take seeds by our fingers and put them in these seeding trays one at a time. And then we evolved to little vibrating spoons, basically, so the seeds would vibrate off of them slowly, and that would speed us up a little bit. Then we came out with a vacuum plate. So you would have this plate that would fit over this seed tray, and there would be a vacuum behind it, would roll out the seeds on that plate, and then flip it over on top, shut off the vacuum, and all the seeds would fall down all at once. In this case, this is a 200 tray. There's 200 cells here, so you can imagine how long it takes to do this by hand. Well, now, this year we acquired a used vacuum seeder. Actually, it's more of a, it's called a needle seeder, but it works off of pneumatic pressure. So this is one step ahead. This would be a very expensive equipment new, but it's about 30 years old and it still works just fine. So the way it works is you put your seeding tray already with the soilless mix in it, as you see here, and we can do a few different size trays. This is a 200 tray. We can do one that's 588 cells. We can also do one that's only 72, depending on the size transplant that we want to go out in the field. So you put your seed tray here, and there's a sensor here to know when that tray has arrived, because this is a conveyor that will automatically forward itself. Once the tray gets to this point, we have this arm here, which has these needles on the end of it. And working off of the pneumatic pressure of the compressor, it will cause a suction, and each needle will grab a seed. Now, if it's a certain type of seed where we actually want to put several per cell, like right now we're actually seeding chives, we want to put a few seeds in each cell. In that case, we can use a larger needle with a bigger orifice at the tip, and we can adjust the vacuum of that needle to suck up even more seeds to it. Now, the needle tip is small enough that the seed will not get sucked through it, it will just get sucked up to it. So here you can see this is a smaller needle than the one that is on the machine presently. You can see if you can zoom in on that, that's a much larger orifice on this one that we're using now, because we're trying to hold about 5 or 7 seeds at a time. If we were using a different size seed or trying to seed only one at a time, we would use a needle like this with a very small orifice in it. And we have about 8 or 10 different needles to put on this machine. Now, we have a lot of different needles that can go in this machine, about 8 or 10 different ones, depending on the seed that we're using, how many seeds we want to seed into the tray. So it's a highly variable machine, depending on how many seeds we want to put in each cell, the size tray, and the size seed. Once the tray forwards to this point, the seeds will come up, get sucked up to the needles, and then the pressure will get turned off for a second, and the seeds will drop. And when they drop down, they'll drop into the cell. Then it will automatically increase, in this case, or advance about 1 inch to the next row of seeds. Also back here is what we call a dibbler. This will make small depressions in the soil for a spot where the seeds can fall. After the tray advances to this point, we have this little hopper which will sprinkle anything that we put into the hopper onto the top of the tray, because you want to cover most of those seeds with a little bit of soilless material. You could use peat moss or something else. In this case, we're actually using vermiculite, which you see here. So we get this from a company locally in Lawrence. It's locally manufactured in Lawrence at Whittemore Company. And this is actually, it's a stone that they bring up to a very high temperature. I forget the temperature, something like 800 or 1,000 degrees. And basically that stone pops. So it's kind of like popcorn. And this is a very nice material to put on top of those seeds to help hold moisture, but not too much moisture. So this whole machine runs off of a little bit of electricity and the compressed air off of the compressor next door. So now I'm going to give it a trial run. We'll see how it works, but because of the noise, I won't be talking so much during it.
Nice release.
So now we've seeded, put all those seeds into the seed trays. So we've seeded the trays. Now we need to germinate all those seeds. We could lay them out on benches in greenhouses, which we've done in the past, but then to get a good germination, you want to keep that greenhouse quite warm, because a nice warm area will get those seeds to germinate quickly. You also want to maintain a high humidity, because if those seeds start to swell and germinate, and then you forget to water them and they dry out, they're going to die pretty quickly. So you want to maintain a high temperature and a high humidity for best germination. And in the winter, high heated greenhouse space is rather expensive. So what do we use? We use a germination chamber, which you see here. And it's a very simple cabinet. You can see it's a stainless steel frame with plexiglass walls and some shelves inside. And outside of it, you see a tank of water. So that tank of water has a little tube coming out the bottom. The tube leads inside, and underneath, you can't really see it too easily, is a pan of water with a small electric heater. And there's a thermostat inside this chamber, which I usually set around 75 or 78 degrees. So when it cools off, it triggers the electric heater to turn on, and when the electric heater turns on, it warms up that water. And as the water warms up, it creates humidity. And that's why inside this cabinet, you can see water droplets, because it's a very high humidity in here. That's so that we don't lose our humidity and get a very good germination. So now we have a high humidity of 95 to 100% humidity, and a temperature usually of somewhere between 75 and 80 degrees, depending on the seeds that we're growing. Now, you can imagine with all, I think there's 10 or 12 shelves in here, if we were to lay all those out onto one layer on a greenhouse bench, that's a lot of greenhouse space. In a shelved cabinet here, where you don't really need sun until they've germinated, we can have a lot more trays in a small footprint rather than in the greenhouse. So here you can see we have a tray of Swiss chard, which will be transplanted out in the field at some point in April. And you can see the seeds are just now germinating. This probably should have come out of the germination chamber yesterday, because once they germinate, you want to get them in the greenhouse, on the bench, in the sun, because if you don't, they're going to get very long and stringy. So we have to come here sometimes twice a day to check and see if any trays have germinated, pull them out, and put them on the greenhouse bench. Depending on the type of seed, it can take anywhere from, I would say, 4 to 14 days to germinate. If they were in a greenhouse that was minimally heated, that went down to say 32 degrees at night, it could take 2 to 3 weeks for those seeds to germinate, depending on the sun. Here in this nice warm cabinet, like I said, 4 to 14 days, and they're up and going. And then we take that tray out, put it on the greenhouse bench, and then we have space for another tray. So we're constantly seeding, and this cabinet has enough space for 100 seed trays. With 100 seed trays every week, you can imagine we can go through a lot of seed trays, and then suddenly the greenhouses will start to fill up quite a bit once we get into late March and April. But then at some point in April, all those plants then move out into the field. So it's this constant rotation from seeding on the seeder to the germination chamber to the greenhouse benches. Possibly then we might upsize it to a larger pot, and then eventually out into the field. Again, utilizing the space as efficiently as possible, cutting the energy cost to do so, and then getting a beautiful crop out of the field. So in this greenhouse, we maintain a much higher temperature at night. Here we'll try to maintain a good 60 degrees in the evening. And because certain crops require that higher temperature. Now lettuce doesn't need such a high temperature, but we have the space, so we threw some lettuce in between these tomato plants just to utilize that space. The lettuce will be harvested in the next 10 days, going in the CSA share. And then after that, these tomato plants will just continue to grow up nice and tall. We can lengthen the string as they get taller. But the tomatoes need that higher temperature. It's a higher temperature, more tropical type crop. And if you let it go below 50 degrees, you actually start losing the blossoms. So this is a higher heated greenhouse. You can see we have tomatoes above, tomatoes below. We'll also grow cucumbers in environments like this, as well as peppers. Okay, so now here we are in an unheated greenhouse, also known as a high tunnel. So we like to have some nice fresh greens to eat as early as possible in the spring. And here we are, the third week of February, and you can see all this beautiful green around us. Normally it's white snow and cold outside, yet without using any heat, we have all this beautiful growth. How do we do it? Well, we've harnessed the power of the sun using the plastic of the greenhouse. So we basically have the greenhouse effect in here. So all that power of the sun is coming through the greenhouse, helping to warm the soil and the air. So the plastic of this greenhouse is providing a totally different climate than what you find outside at this time of year. So in a sense, right now, even though we're in New England, it's almost like these crops are growing in the Carolinas because we've brought the temperatures of down there to here inside this greenhouse. So how do we do this? We seeded the spinach here back in the end of September. The kale we seeded the beginning of September, and then transplanted it into the ground here around the first week of October. So then in September, October, November, these plants grew, extended out their roots so that they have a nice strong root system in this nice nutrient dense earth. And then pretty much all of December and January, nothing grows. Not so much because of the lack of warmth, but because of the lack of sun. There's just so little sun here in December and January, we were almost banking this growth in the winter. And then by the time we get to February, the intensity of the sun increases so much that you can see these plants are now starting to jump for joy. And now we'll be able to start harvesting this spinach and kale for the first week of the CSA, the first week of March. And this stuff is absolutely delicious. You can eat it raw, you can cook it, it's great for salads. And all this without using any heat at all. It's a beautiful thing of nature. So here we are now in a slightly heated greenhouse. So this greenhouse I just maintain at about 30, 32 degrees at night. When we first seed the greenhouse, I'll let the temperature go down as low as 26 because nothing has emerged from the soil yet. Once we get emergence, then I try to keep it around 30, 32 so that we don't get any freeze damage to these things. Because we are seeding these as early as mid-January. Now, in December or January, I feel like you get almost no growth of anything because of the low sun levels. But because we're seeding them January 15th, they don't need sun much by then because they haven't emerged yet. By the time that they've emerged around the 1st of February, we're starting to get some sun to create growth. So now here we are, and it's the 3rd week of February. These were seeded about almost a month ago on January 29th. This is tatsoi, also known as Chinese spinach. And so you can see how it looks after 1 month of growth using almost no heat to grow these. Now these are also planted on a rolling bench, and these rolling benches allow us to maximize the space in the greenhouse because now we don't need all these walkways to get between these benches because we can just push them out of the way and basically have one walkway for the whole length of the greenhouse. If we need to get between them like I am now, we just need to roll them out of the way to access. So that gives us about 15% more growing space in that same greenhouse by eliminating all of those walkways. Now in this bench, we've got about 2 inches of compost. That gives us all of our nutrients. And then on top of that is a vermiculite peat moss mix. And I used to seed directly into the compost, but I found that sometimes we were getting a lot of diseases from that compost. The peat moss being sterile gives us a nice sterile environment, which is important when we're growing in these harsh, cold, damp conditions of January and February. So we have the compost for the nutrients, the peat moss for a sterile germination area, and then these will just start to germinate and grow. Right now they're kind of at a micro stage. We could harvest them at this stage, or let them get a little bit bigger for another 2 weeks or so, and then harvest them as a baby tatsoi. The nice thing about tatsoi and a lot of our lettuce mixes and bok choy is we can harvest them 2 or 3 times. So we'll harvest them in about 2 weeks, let them grow for another 2 weeks, harvest them again, let them grow for another 2 weeks, and then harvest yet again. So then we're getting 3 harvests over a 1.5-month period. By then, it's probably going to be about mid-April, and we need this greenhouse space then for all of our tomato and pepper transplants for the field. So this greenhouse then gets a secondary use by mid-April, and then it's in use for about 6 weeks for those field transplants. So it's giving us another 2.5 months of greenhouse usage when maybe it would be otherwise empty. So we've created this nice little system utilizing very little energy to get yet another crop out of a underutilized space in the farm. So this is a baby tatsoi, and then here on this bench we have a sweet mix, which was seeded, you can see on the date, about 10 days after this. So this is a 10-day difference in growth in the same greenhouse because we don't want to bunch up our harvest too much, or the first harvest at least. So sometimes we'll seed several benches 1 week and then wait a week and then seed some more. We have several greenhouses that we grow in like this. The first one again gets seeded around January 15th, and the last one will get seeded around February 15th. So about a 1 month seeding period, which will then give us about a 2 to 2.5 month harvest period. We grow a sweet mix, a lettuce mix, a spicy mix, baby bok choy, baby tatsoi, arugula. Sometimes we'll put in some cilantro, dill, and a few other crops. Sometimes we'll even grow a head lettuce in the greenhouses in the same way. But also being in the controlled greenhouse, if we get a cold, snowy period in January and this greenhouse is completely covered by snow, we can also add a little bit of heat to get those seeds to germinate, because if you leave them in a moist soil, cold soil for very long, they might eventually start to rot. So we have that option of giving them a little bit of heat. But then on the flip side, we also have vents that will open on a thermostat and an exhaust fan that will open if I feel that the growth is too fast. Because in this greenhouse, oftentimes on a nice sunny winter day, it can be 30 to 40 degrees above the outside temperature. So if we get a 60-degree day or even a 50-degree day, then you're talking about a 90-degree temperature inside, what will happen if you get very low night temperatures, because we're not really trying to put much heat in here, and a very high daytime temperature, you'll get a very stretched, elongated green. And we don't want that. So oftentimes I'll have the vents open around 60 degrees and then an exhaust fan turn off on at 70, so it never gets above 70. Also, I can regulate the growth. If I find that they're growing too fast, I can turn down that daytime temperature a little bit by having that vent open as low as 45 degrees and the exhaust fan start at 50 degrees, just to slow down that growth. So we can speed up and slow down our production depending on the environment outside or on our needs for the CSA. So this is the first greenhouse that we start up in the winter, usually mid-January, sometimes maybe even a week earlier if we have to. And the reason I like to use this greenhouse first is because we have these two black water tanks in this greenhouse set on the south side without any shade obstructions outside the greenhouse. So as you can imagine, you get a sunny day in January and February, and that sun's coming through the greenhouse walls, hitting this black plastic. It's going to warm up that plastic, and then inside that plastic tank is about 1,000 gallons of water times 2 tanks. So basically what we can do here is we can take that heat of the sun, capture it into these tanks in a reservoir of water, and then that massive heat, which can sometimes get up to 50 to 60 degrees inside the tanks, at night that heat's going to slowly radiate back into the greenhouse environment. So then if we have say a 15-degree night outside and I've got the thermostat set at 25, this is going to be helping to reduce our fuel usage, our energy usage, by simply radiating that heat that was gained during the day. So it's basically a heat sink or a heat bank to hold that heat of the sun. If we wanted, we could add some piping to try to capture more of that heat, to circulate some water through some black pipes, almost like some solar radiant collectors, and then pump the water back. That would take a little bit more energy, and also then we would have to be careful of that water not freezing in those pipes. So I've kept it a little bit simple. Perhaps I could maximize it a little bit more if I wanted to, but then that would cause other concerns about freezing water. Right now this water will never freeze in these tanks because there's so much of it. And you can see all the nice green growth that this system that I've developed is creating. These greens were seeded right around January 19th or 15th, and with minimal fuel usage, almost nothing in fact. You can see all that growth from the heat of the sun. So in these winter greenhouses, we're choosing to grow the crops that withstand the cold temperatures better, so that we don't need to heat the greenhouse as much as we have to otherwise. Trying to create as green of agricultural production as possible. And here, for example, you can see a nice bed of radishes. So radishes, for example, are a nice crop to grow in cooler weather. Much like arugula, like we see over here. This nice baby arugula, we could start picking this any time now. And here we have a nice sunny February day where it's about 30 degrees outside, and right now it's probably 60 degrees inside. So if I wanted to, I could have these vents open and the exhaust fan come on and keep this greenhouse down to 50 degrees if I wanted to slow down the growth of this. Or I could let this greenhouse get up to probably 80 degrees today if I wanted to speed things up. So I have that capacity to speed up and slow down the growth in the greenhouse. So in this greenhouse, we just seeded about 2 days ago. And you can see the benches are nice and level. Nothing's germinated yet, but they're nice and moist. Now here we are, we have a nice sunny winter day. And with that sun, I'll allow this greenhouse to get up to 80 or 90 degrees today during the day, because I want the soil in these benches to absorb all that heat, so then at night, when this greenhouse might go down to 25 degrees because it's a cold winter night, around those seeds will hopefully still be 50, 60, maybe even as high as 70 degrees, encouraging those seeds to germinate, and germinate quickly. Because the longer that they're sitting in a cold soil, not germinated, increases the possibility that they might just rot and die. So I'm utilizing that heat of the sun. And the other thing we'll do is I'll watch the weather before we seed. And if I see a forecast of several days of cloudy, snowy weather, I'll delay seeding until we're going to have several days of nice sunny warm weather to help to warm the soil around those seeds without using any heat.